Welcome back on the second day of Future of Mining. And yesterday's keynote session, John from Resolute talked about this beautiful audience. And he made a comment that this audience is one of the most progressive in the mining industry. And I would like to start this conversation with our panelists with that thought that this audience is not only one of the most progressive in the mining, we as a generation are very special in terms of the technological transformation that we have seen in our life. I was 5-year-old when I first talked over the phone, the physical phone, and I can still remember that red piece of brick, very heavy, and more than the physical description of the phone, what I recall is the fear and the feeling of that weird experience that I'm talking to someone that is not in the room, and I can't see him. And that feeling is still with me. And from that point on, the technological changes have actually moved so rapidly from telephonic conversation to mobility and to smartphones. And all along, we as a generation have done tremendously well in terms of the change management, in terms of the behavioral change that is required for the success of technological change. We have adopted really well with the telephones, with the mobile phones, and with the smartphones, to the extent that we are now at the mercy of our smartphones. We have done really well. And if you remember, when the smartphones just really started, we had the darling of smartphones with the corporate BlackBerry. I don't know how many people actually use BlackBerry. I used to use it, and at that time, there was no substitute to BlackBerry because the very good, efficient keyboard. And BlackBerry thought that people are not going to go away from the touch key buttons that we have provided. And because the user behavior, the behavioral change required was so massive, BlackBerry put their entire future on the keyboard. Apple changed it. They betted against it and said, no, I'm going to change the user behavior. I'm going to drive this behavior change. And today, BlackBerry is nowhere. So more important than the technological change, the behavioral change are there. And I give you one more example. Uber and Lyft, they lose money since the day they started. Every single ride that you take, Uber is losing money. Still, their valuation is in tens of billions of dollars. Why? Not because they have exceptional technology, but because they are exceedingly well in driving the user experience, driving the behavioral change. We are getting addicted to that rideshare mentality. And whatever money that they are losing today, we are going to pay it once, maybe in 5 years, maybe 10 years. Same story, Netflix. When Netflix raised their prices 2 months back, the stock prices rise beyond expectations. Because they raised price, they could raise the prices. So the user experience, that the change management is the key before we drive the technological change. And that is the key concept, the key theme today, in not only in mining, but also in every different industry where we want to implement the technology. Because the user experience, the user behavioral change is so important, so fundamental to technology. And this is what is our theme for today. And before I go there, there's going to be a press release this afternoon from Uptake about our partnership with Codelco. But because I love you so much, I want to share this news with you first. So we signed a deal with Codelco in Chile for an enterprise-level partnership. And why I'm telling you this, because the most important conversation that we have had for the last 6 months was not about how Uptake AI is great. How are you going to solve my business cases by applying technology? It was about the Spanish-speaking workforce, those who do not really know about AI or the software. How are you going to derive the change? How are you going to make them use this software? Because if this software, they don't use it, it's not going to be successful. The technological change is only as successful as the behavioral change. So with that thought, I would like to start with my panel today. Thank you very much. Please give a big hand for Michelle, Friska, and Brandon. So I would like to start with you, Michelle. Mm-hmm. So when you think about technological implementation in the industry,
Yep.
Just to set the level for this conversation, how important is the change management?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think the change management is fundamentally important. And, I've spoken in a number of different venues saying that, whilst the technology is important, and I'm not taking away anything from the brilliant people that develop the technology, that it's around about 30% of the solution. The 70% of the solution is actually not only the use case and the value of that use case, but how you get people to change their behaviours. And often we focus on the technology. In fact, we try to compete with the technology. But in fact, really what we should be doing is collaborating on the technology, working together as an industry. But then if you want to compete on something, compete on how rapidly you can adopt that into your own organisation. And really the technology is just an enabler. No matter how fundamentally important it is. It's the behavioural change that is what we're really wanting, because that's what drives the productivity improvement, that's what drives the safety improvement. So really, the change management, or I prefer to think about it as the behavioural change, that's actually what you're really trying to achieve.
Excellent. I think that's a great start of the conversation. And Brendan, I would like to follow up with you is, when you try to do this change or the behavioral change management, what resistance do you see in the organization? What are the typical kinds of resistance when you try to ask people to do certain things and you see that it's not happening?
Yeah. I mean, I could maybe take a bit of a step back and explain a bit of the journey that Rio Tinto has been on in the past couple of years, because it's been a really exciting change that we've seen in the organisation. We're a 146-year-old company. We have a really very proud history, but we've got a CEO in John Sebastian Jacques at the moment that recognises that what's got us to this point and what's kept us strong for the past 146 years isn't necessarily what's going to keep us strong for the next 45 years. So we really need to recognise that the risk of not changing is really profound, right? And we actually really need to recognise that if we're not more agile and we're not more adaptive to what's going on in the environment around us, then we are going to get left behind, and we're going to be, the Kodak of the mining industry, and that's absolutely what we don't want. Look, there's all sorts of resistance. The culture is a big part of it. The culture is built up over many years, and it's been really interesting seeing how our current CEO sort of tries to chip away at that through lots of different channels. And for new entrants to Rio Tinto, one of the things that I think they would find quite confronting is the use of the internal social media platforms, right? Whereby our CEO is on Yammer pretty much every day. You see him taking selfies on Yammer, his whatever sort of thought bubble comes, it's there, it's out there. And it's sort of really threatening all of these long-standing conventions for how information is shared across organisations. Some people are really embracing it, some people are feeling very threatened by it, but it's really fundamentally changing it. There's been other simple things like the adoption of a no-tie policy across Rio Tinto, which seems like a silly little thing, right? I mean, why is the CEO talking about whether or not people are wearing ties? But ties have been a long-standing symbol of management versus the workers, right? And it can create a real obstacle between us and them. And so what we're trying to do is sort of break down all of those potential obstacles that mean that an organisation isn't prepared to adapt and change. I'll just give one more example of one other thing that we've done recently, and that's introduce a small incubator for what Rio Tinto 4.0 might look like. And we've actually created a small group of people that have been carved out, sort of hand-picked out of the organisation to really, really come up with a vision for what Rio Tinto 4.0 might look like. How does Rio Tinto intersect with the fourth industrial revolution, and what do we do about that? So in lots of different ways, we're trying to attack this sort of cultural inertia, which is really preventing us from changing as an organisation.
That's some of the great points that you have raised, and that will help us in asking more questions to Friska and Michelle. So Friska, my next question to you, and it is in line with what Brendan had just mentioned about that when you try to implement change, and try to change the organization fabric, try to make it more agile. Sometimes it's said that it's more effective if it is top-down rather than the bottom-up. So for example, when Rio Tinto CEO J.S. Checker says that let's not wear the tie, let's make it more informal, taking selfie and trying to be more human than machine. So do you think that this is the right approach, or should we have some sort of a both ways convergence change management?
I think it's not one or the other. I think it's both. So with any change to be sustainable, it does need that top-down support. But then it will not be sustained if there's no grassroots energy enthusiasm. And so your people will prioritize what you prioritize. So they look up for role models. So if they walk the talk, then slowly but surely people will. And the challenge is to maintain that energy and enthusiasm, because you could go months without any validation, any feedback, any endorsement that you're actually making a difference. But it's what separates truly successful companies that are good at change and those that are not. They keep going. So it's the endurance that is rare, because anyone can start something, right? A diet, a New Year's resolution, but it's a different kettle of fish for someone to keep going despite all of that. Yeah.
Got it. So Michelle, coming to you, your previous role with Barrick as the CIO, where you essentially laid the foundation of Barrick being the digital company that they wanted to be. When you think about starting such massive technological initiatives in a company, how important it is to understand the human-centric requirements, the operational requirements, as against the technological priorities or something that might be investor-driven, and how do you find that balance between selecting the right technology or finding the right problem to solve?
Yeah, and look, it is a very fine balance. So what we found was that it's both directions. It does have to start leader-led, does have to start from the top, and I think the tone and other things. And we certainly had to lay a strategy for what do we think needed to be done and what sort of technologies fit within that. But we also try not to be too prescriptive, because you also need to have some groundswell from those who are accountable, such as the GMs and the managers, et cetera, to choose within that framework some of the specifics, both in terms of the projects that are going to add most value to their operation, the specific style of the technology, and sometimes the implementation process. And we also found we had to layer it. So I think it's really hard to implement any form of technology, digital or otherwise, on top of inefficient processes. So we actually started with first ops excellence business improvement and really driving efficiency within our assets, sweating the assets, getting people used to managing projects, changing the way they did things, because often operational excellence is really around getting people to drive performance of trucks or equipment through different sort of mechanisms. And then once we had people comfortable with managing projects, managing portfolios of projects, driving the assets, sweating the assets, then we could start laying over the top of that digital technologies. And so we had a strategy for those digital technologies. We looked at 22 different systems. We narrowed that down to 10. From a central perspective, we presented that to the board, to executives, to investor committees, selected a site that would be the exemplar site, and then really that worked with that GM and that site to identify, well, what were their specific pain points? Where was the biggest value for them within this strategy? How did that order the priorities? And then really enabled them, set the team up, got them the funding, enabled them with projects and processes to actually then drive for themselves the implementation of those projects. And then the same thing with innovation. The innovation we then put over the top of that. And there were a few subtle differences in terms of how many people we got involved with developing the strategy. It was much wider than the digital review. But again, same sort of process. Here's the way you go about doing innovation. Here's some of the topics that are most important. Here's the strategy. And then different sites saw different value in some of those projects, and then of course drove those projects and worked with much more agile techniques with the operators, the maintainers, the supervisors. Because I mean, one of the things we found with a lot of the implementation of these technologies is you actually fundamentally change people's roles, and sometimes not the ones you expect. So when we implemented connectivity to the face, and essentially an iPhone and some basic data and information down at the operators, we knew where people were, equipment was, where they were up to with their tasks. We actually thought the people who would be most affected were the operators and maintainers, because they were going to have to put information into these things, they were going to have to use this data. But in fact, it was the supervisor's role that was the most changed, and we had most pushback from the supervisors because they had originally felt that their role was about information distribution. They spent a lot of their time telling people what their work was and then making sure that everybody knew what was going on and distributing information. But now that information was in real time being distributed, so they're going, well, like, what's our role now? And so we had to actually really think, well, okay, what do you want the supervisor to do now that they don't have to spend 8 to 12 hours a day distributing information? And it came back much more to problem solving, using that experience that they had to solve problems and to prioritise which problems to solve. And then it's interesting because things that we didn't think people would do with these technologies, suddenly they were doing. So you give somebody an iPhone underground and connectivity, they start FaceTiming, and they'll FaceTime an engineer or somebody in supply or a maintainer and say, hey, this is the problem I'm having, what do you think? And we had never dreamed that people were going to use that technology for those ways.
If I could just build on the points that Michelle was making there about the understanding the pain points, because I think that so often we think that we've got a solution and we've got a new piece of technology that's really cool and it might have a fantastic business case, but we haven't really understood the user experience. And maybe it's a sort of a little silly example, but just in my team recently, I noticed, we introduced a platform called Microsoft Teams, and it's a fantastic means of connecting with the team and interacting with them on a day-to-day basis. But the promise was that this is going to cut down your email by 80, 90%, right? Because all of this traffic that normally comes in via email.
So it's like Slack by Microsoft.
That's right, yeah.
Exactly.
The actual experience has been that you get up in the morning now, you need to check Microsoft Teams and the email has to cut down, and there's Yammer. And so it never actually ever seemed to get simpler, right? And that's why people push back and they resist, because the end user experience hasn't really been fully contemplated and understood, I don't think, when some of these changes have been introduced.
Well, and we haven't changed people's behaviour. It's around, well, what was the behavioural change you wanted between those two different products?
That's right. Yeah.
And now people are sending them both, it sounds
That's
like.
Right.
And then, Michelle, thanks. You have given very good fuel to the next set of questions. After we have identified the problems that really matters to the operations and to the stakeholders, when we start implementing those changes, and Friska, this question is for you, that when we start implementing those changes or we start implementing a new technology or new solution, are we doing a good job as an industry to connect the dots with the people? Or just like Brendan mentioned that Microsoft Teams, we launched it and said everybody is going to use it without even thinking about, are we connecting the dots, or do people really want it? And I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but are we doing it in general before starting a new technology or new project?
I can only speak for Newcrest. So we work quite closely with each site, and we've actually got digital delivery teams focused on that, and that ensures not only are we working on the right problems, but the solution is fit for purpose. But there's always room for improvement. As an industry as a whole, I don't think we're there yet. I think we're very immature on the change management curve, and there needs to be an education piece exactly what it is. And like Michelle said, it complements the technology. Like, it's nonsensical to invest so much in the right tools without equal, if not more, attention to the people that will ultimately be using them. So it's very rare to find a dedicated change management team in this industry. Yeah.
Interesting. And I just want to follow up on that with you, Brandon. When you think about implementing, and I just want to double click on this question, is that when you think about different departments, different teams, there is friction. There's always some sort of a silos behavior, and people are used to, and it goes back to your point that we are trying to change the inertia. How difficult it is, and how do we manage that, the dynamics between the departments?
Yeah, look, in a company as big and diverse as Rio Tinto, there are many different tribes and there are many different subcultures there, and it is often very, very hard. Often even just language barriers and all these sorts of things. And so one of the important things that we've done in the past few years is actually come up with a purpose that really resonates with people, a sort of a why. And formerly it used to be, we deliver superior shareholder value, and you can imagine how inspirational that is when you get up in the morning, right? It's sort of like, whoa, here we go, more superior shareholder value, right? And it's such an intangible concept. And so we've shifted to, as pioneers in mining and metal, we produce the materials essential to human progress, right? And it's a fantastic story, right? It really has an emotional attachment with people. It really reflects on the pioneering history of the organisation, but it makes that connection between what someone does in their day-to-day life to making people's life better in society. And I think that having that sort of overarching sort of purpose has been really important for saying, hey, we're all in this together. We all really need to pitch in and sort of, join hands and sort of work together on this. But that doesn't mean that people always play nicely, right? And you do need to take a sort of a systems approach as well. And I think, you need to embed this into the way that you reward people. It needs to be part of your incentive schemes. That collaborative behaviour needs to be recognised and rewarded. We've tried things like, the Not Invented Here awards, whereby those individuals that are shamelessly copying stuff from one part of the business and dropping it in their part of the business, they get a prize, and I think that's good. That's behaviour that we want to recognise and reward. We've also introduced a new sort of career pathways process that recognises that if you want to advance your career as a technical specialist, there is pathways to do that. And one of the mechanisms to get advancement through that pathway is you need to demonstrate that you're a good collaborator, that you're able to join the dots across the organisation, that you're able to sort of transcend the traditional organisational silos and actually connect people and sort of break down those things that are sort of preventing us from working more closely together. So there's lots. It's a huge challenge, and I think given the opportunity, people will always revert to tribal behaviour, unfortunately, and I think we need to be aware of that. But there are things that you can do to try and break it down.
Got it. And I just want to, considering the time, I want to change the gears a little bit here, and going to the communication aspect of technological transformation, digital transformation, and many changes or many technological improvements or many investments, they happen because the mining companies, they want to look progressive in the market. They want to tell their investors that your future, your investment is safe with me because I'm progressive, I'm thinking digital, I'm thinking the new technologies that can change the way things work. I'm there. You don't have to worry about your money. It's a very investment-heavy industry. So when we try to make that statement that can bolster our image in the market, from a communication perspective, Friska, that when we try to make that communication to the market that we are progressive, we are going to transform ourselves, how do we balance the communication internally within the company that it is not going to be transformational, it's going to be organic, it's going to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and there is no need to alert, there is no need to alarm, it is just a market. So in this world where the communication is like one way, you drop the water somewhere and it's going to spread instantly. So how do you find a balance between investor communication, market communication versus employee communication?
I think the underlying principle and what change management is for, it enables you to disrupt without being disrupted. So that means maintaining productivity dips, engaging employees and getting that buy-in internally before you go out to the market. So to get that buy-in first, the first fundamental building block in change management is awareness. So awareness not only of what's changing, but why it's changing. And it's only after you get that internal buy-in should you go externally, because you should always engage your own people first. Yeah. And after you've cemented the why, maybe engage your people, get them to come up with the how, because the most effective programs stem from grassroots innovation. Not in the industry, for example, GE, they have a legendary program called Workout, where employees were simply told why things needed to change. So it was geared at internal efficiencies, and they formed their own teams and projects. And to this day, it's one of the most successful in the company's history. So it's very rare that employees get that chance to decide for themselves how they'll contribute to a company's why.
Very interesting. So Brendan, I'm just going to follow up on that. When it comes to employee communication, as a company,